largely informed by sociology, but he engages across disciplines to tackle issues in a range of contexts, including sport, education and medicine. And Gareth is going to talk about his work around school-based physical activity interventions.
Thank you very much, and I think the talk actually follows on quite nicely from Steph's talk, and also the questions that were asked as well, so hopefully this can contribute a little bit. So inequalities in young people's physical activity, how can school-based interventions make more of a difference? So in considering the case of social disadvantage from socioeconomic inequalities, the background context that we need to touch on is the idea that income inequalities have been growing over the last 3 decades. This means that social class differences are alive and well, I'm sure you know this. So prominent economists of inequality like Thomas Piketty have highlighted the roughly doubling of income for the top 1% in this relatively recent period and the quadrupling of the top 0.1%. But relevant also is the notion that inequalities are generational, intergenerational. So this is important because social class is made meaningful through this intergenerational lens. So in thinking about this, I take some inspiration from the Great British Class Survey, which was published about 5 years ago, carried out by Mike Savage and colleagues at the LSE. So the authors claimed in this study that contemporary social class structures are most accurately described by 7 class fractions rather than the 3 we might be used to describing them as. 2 of which are now needed to describe the groups below what would be traditionally referred to as the traditional working class, so referred to as the precariat. And they're experiencing an increasing level of social isolation, economic deprivation, and lack of cultural participation. So, in following a number of notable scholars, like Paul Willis, for example, in his book Learning to Labour, Stephen Ball, Beverly Skeggs, Diane Ray, John Evans, Alan Berner, my talk today returns to the idea that social class still matters. So, following on from social class, as we all know, and as what we're here for at this conference, is health inequalities. So the notion that the affluent live longer, healthier lives than the non-affluent is well established. Here we can point to the work of Wilkinson and Pickett, Michael Marmot, for example, as leaders in the field. The body of literature here tells us that there's at least an 18-year difference, in some cases, in life expectancy between the richest and poorest boroughs in the UK. And health inequalities may even be widening in some cases. So, given that the health-enhancing benefits of physical activity have now been widely demonstrated, the attempt to address inequalities in physical activity is more crucial than ever. And for this reason, we should probably be concerned that the Active People Survey and numerous other studies suggest that lower socioeconomic groups tend to be less active. So, why study young people in schools, which is the topic of this research? So I'm focusing on this setting fundamentally because I think it's important to understand the reproduction of class culture. So young people are the future and they are arguably the most active and well supported, but we need to recognise that children learn in these informative years will probably stick with them. So we need to get physical activity right in schools, and getting it right might make health promotion a little bit easier later down the line. So this age group is also of particular research interest, because young people in the schools are the target of lots of costly interventions at the moment as well. So national strategies in the UK, like Healthy Schools recently, Change for Life, and also lots of interventionist trials that we do with schools, as well as BMI measurements. So the research that I'm going to talk about today builds on from my PhD research, which I finished about 4 years ago. Ethnography is a prominent theme in all these talks, and I would certainly describe mine as ethnographic, but also engaged in other complementary methods as well. So data collection took place in a Midlands town in England across 4 school settings, and the schools were chosen based on partly their socioeconomic status. So I looked at the percentage of pupils receiving free school meal and area level indices of multiple deprivation and fee status, and I ended up with 4 schools. 1 was a fee-paying school, 1 was in really quite deprived area, and 2 had a kind of mix, were quite in the middle. And that was at the school level, but at the level of the individual, I'm going to talk to you today about data that I collected with 29 pupils. And they were diverse in terms of, again, free school meal eligibility, with a group of them that were eligible for free school meals, and also physical activity levels. Kind of got some people who are highly active and people who are inactive, and also gender as well. So roughly a 50-50 split between boys and girls. So ethnographic field notes were taken from my active participation in school life through fulfilling various different roles. So I was a school visitor, I was a lesson observer, that was for PE and the health and personal social development lessons. I was a PE teaching assistant on a few occasions and an after-school clubs volunteer. And also I like Steph's idea of just hanging out. There's a little bit of hanging out going on, but I guess I'd add to that hanging out with a question, with a research question in mind. So this took place over 6 months. I made some 42 ethnographic field notes, but also more importantly was the kind of ongoing conversation internally about what the research was about and what sorts of questions I could ask later. So a valuable asset for those observations was the sensitivity for otherwise taken for granted values and practices in the school. So what Prosser describes as the unconscious culture of the school that you might not notice otherwise. Another value was the ability to break down some barriers that are typical in research encounters that are often brief one-off visits. So I feel like I was able to get to a place where participants really trusted me and to some extent gained potential insights that I couldn't have otherwise. So in terms of linking with other methods, I also gathered 60 focus group recordings, 95 still photos, and some video clips as well. And here's just one of the video clips, for example.
Hello, this is Screwy. Say hi. Right, go. You're going to go again. Do it again.
So nice to see see what's going on without any adults present. You know, the fact that we can all have insight into that, I think, is quite a useful thing, and it was a useful thing for me to help talk through similar questions during the focus groups. I've split my kind of discussion and findings and analysis into two kind of ideas. One is the types of activities that were done, and the other is the way that they're done. So unsurprisingly, children at the well-funded school that boasted excellence in sporting opportunities and success the pupils there showed significant inclination towards sport. So one of the pupils said to me, on Mondays I do football, Tuesdays we do fitness work, Wednesdays I do hockey with a local team that's involved with the school, Thursdays I do football again, I have Friday off, Saturdays I do hockey, Sundays I chill out, go with friends, maybe play some golf, some Sundays I play football, and then another pupil chipped in and said on Mondays I do cross country, then I do tennis, on Tuesdays I go swimming, and then I want to do taekwondo as well. So an abundance of opportunities, an abundance of activities available to them, and you can kind of go through each of them if you want and look at how the circumstances have allowed that. So this amount of activity and also the type of activity, that kind of organised school sports, was really interesting, and it was made possible through their circumstances. So now, despite engaging in football, so some of the pupils at this fee-paying grammar school explained that it was not an option because actually football's not posh enough for this school. So one pupil saying we want to do it, but they class it as a lower man's sport. Mr. Moles calls it the F word. Everyone at the grammar school likes playing football, but the teachers don't let us do it because it's chavvy. So remembering these participants are 13 and 14 years old, this tacit understanding of the appropriateness of certain sporting practices demonstrates an early class-based demarcation between active young people in different social circumstances. So whether these pupils endorse that practice at this stage or not is a moot point. We must assume that at some point they will learn something from their schooling. These data are illustrative of people residing in certain social fields and embodying their logic by appreciating themselves in relation to these fields. So in this process that facilitates people discerning what is and what's not for the likes of us. Okay, so that's a key idea that I kept moving forward with. So contrasting the grammar school pupils with pupils from low socioeconomic status school was interesting. It seemed that different kinds of activities were popular. So similar to Steph's talk, the pupils have said, we're always out, we're biking, scootering, walking. That's the sort of stuff that I do. So while scootering was clearly a physical activity that some participants in our study showed an inclination towards, it seemed to carry a symbolic value in particular fields, and part of it was in that it took place outside of schools. So in a similar way, one of the pupils talked about free running, so parkour like we saw in the last talk. A key difference, because he identified as a naughty student, was the notion that free running was an additional way to enact an anti-school and anti-authority practice. So he said that's how it started off. We were just getting chased by the police, and then we started vaulting, and you go through the bar like that. So this is the kind of image that he's referring to. You run, you've got to put your hand on it, you've got to jump, and he was really animated when he was telling me. And I fell over, I smacked my face, I've nearly broke my nose, I've got bruises all over me, I broke my neck, I nearly broke my arm, I've nearly broke my legs. So this kind of reflects and alludes to free running as an anarchical post-sport practice that Mike Atkinson refers to it as, and one that involves substantial risk. So despite this clear enthusiasm for physical activity in this context, it's interesting that when I suggested that the school should set up a lunchtime club for free running, Keith dismissed it immediately, straight away, saying that it wouldn't be the same. So free running is symbolically different within and outside of the school, especially when enacted in the kinds of ways that the pupil explains. Clearly, if we think of this activity as a practice that is commensurate and constitutive of his emerging identity and disposition, then incorporating free running into school PE would require a compromise of his preferences or a disruption to the practice itself. Similarly, when low socioeconomic status participants were unable to get to the skate park on the other side of town, they'd seek to go scootering in the streets and of local housing estates and also near supermarkets, but they were often kicked off, and the managers and security guards threatened to call police. So what's problematic here perhaps is that if participants see their chosen activity as being excluded from official endorsement, it may follow that they see themselves as excluded too. So what's something that I'm drawing on from Pierre Bourdieu is the idea that people follow the leanings of their habitus, of their emerging dispositions themselves, in order to find an activity which is entirely them. So, secondly, I wanted to talk about ways of doing physical activity practices that embodied social class. So this analysis also illustrates that class-based differences were relevant in the ways that people did physical activity within schools. So one of the schools which was, had one of those mixes of people from a range of backgrounds, explicit demarcations between well-behaved and poorly behaved groups had classed undertones. Again, the word chav was used in a derogatory way. And middle-class pupils would talk about chavs as deviant, wearing particular clothes when I asked them kind of who are these people, and walking in a particular way. They were talking about kind of dipping, and it was very kind of condescending. So, though not directly related to physical activity, this kind of class-based belittlement is inherently tied to our interest in how the body is used as part of a physical culture that serves to distinguish pupils by their embodied and habitual activity to conduct themselves or not with the schools or with a middle-class version of propriety. So a particularly telling distinction was reflected in pupils' reluctance to seem keenly and obediently to apply personal effort in physical activity. So something that I noticed quite a lot was the term CBA being used. If people have got young children, does anyone know what CBA? CBA means can't be asked, apparently. And they say it all the time. When I ask about physical activity, are you going to do this, are you going to do that? CBA would come back very often. And it was something that would happen in the schools with the lower socioeconomic status pupils, but nothing I heard in the higher level. So, indeed, this is consistent with the earlier assertion that the chavs don't seem to care. So I'd suggest that the use of the CBA is not an isolated cultural meme, but a symbolic way to signify the speaker doesn't want to openly appear to be applying personal effort. So in the same way, perhaps, that educational success for some working class pupils is problematic because it can be an abandonment of one's own background. So these data suggest that obediently applying personal effort towards physical activity was experienced as being problematic. So taking this to an extreme, other pupils were very, very proud of the fact they skipped PE, and sometimes they would go for a fag instead of going to lessons. So my suggestion here is that does this lead to an inequality paradox? So what I'm referring to here is the potential for population health interventions to inadvertently and accidentally exacerbate health inequalities. So in this situation, we can all totally agree that well thought through physical activity interventions are probably going to encourage some well-engaged middle-class pupils to be more active, but I find it really hard to see how the same interventions, without being thought through, will engage the types of children and the social groups that we might need to reach. So learning about their social class position can be enduring in that we need to think about how that might affect their future trajectories in physical activity. So how can we make more of a difference? I've not got as optimistic words as I do as the posture there, but maybe some potential ideas. So I think it's important that we remember inequality is neither individual nor structural. So we've said today it's at least partially matters of embodied inclinations and dispositions that are already evident at a young age. So echoing Schilling's paraphrasing of Marx, we could say that people make their bodies through labour, sport and play, but they don't make them in circumstances of their own choosing. So it's also important to consider the context, not just the activity. So that parkour free running example works well here. So the meaning of it inside and outside of school might make a difference. There may be activities that work well for disadvantaged pupils, but they're probably not going to come from maybe people like us. People like me, for example. I shouldn't go around asking me what they should be doing. So maybe forming coalitions and co-creating ideas, like the great work that Fiona and Sarah are doing in another project, forming a coalition with schools so they can help generate ideas themselves. And finally, a much broader point that I pick up from Wilkinson and Pickett's The Spirit Level is probably that we need to pick our heads up a little bit and see that there are lots of inequalities in so many different domains that rather than trying to focus on solving it in ourselves, actually they're all connected to inequality ultimately. So vote Corbyn, basically. And that's where I'm going to end. Thank you.